Earth was classified as a delay, not a threat. From the Imperial flagship's command spire, the blue-green planet filled half the tactical sphere, serene and utterly unimpressive. Sensor lattices peeled it apart in layers, population clusters, industrial output, orbital traffic, each metric confirming what Doctrine already knew. Primitive, kinetic-bound, over-armored, culturally defiant, a relic world. Processing designation? The Grand Evaluator asked, voice smooth with boredom. Category 3, the systems prefect replied. Non-compliant but isolated, estimated pacification time under 4 minutes. Approval rippled through the chamber. 4 minutes was generous. The Imperial Fleet numbered 10,000 hulls, arranged in flawless orbital shells at 120,000 kilometers. Weapons cold only because etiquette demanded the courtesy of logging first contact. Against them, Earth's defenders registered as 67 combat-capable ships, most mass-heavy and inelegant, their signatures loud with chemical residue and old radiation scars. They looked reinforced. Armor bias confirmed. An analyst. Noted. Inefficient mass distribution indicates fear. Fear was expected. Fear was manageable. The humans transmitted a signal then, plain band and unencrypted, pushed hard enough to cut through the Imperial command net. It was logged automatically and queued for translation behind internal traffic. Continue processing, the Grand Evaluator said. Log the signal as cultural noise. Invasion protocols spun up, target lists populated, orbital lanes were marked for denial, population centers for suppression. Casualty projections scrolled with comforting certainty. Imperial losses rounded to 0, human losses expressed in percentages large enough to be abstract. Processing queue set. A junior tactician hesitated. There is density variance in their hulls, layered structures beyond expected tolerances. Redundant armor, someone scoffed. They've not learned to trust shields. Laughter followed, polite and restrained. Shields were elegance. Armor was an admission of inferiority. The fleet's power curves rose in synchronized steps, energy arrays harmonizing across thousands of vessels. The first volley was scheduled for exactly 0:04 after classification, a ceremonial precision meant to remind observers that the Empire did nothing in haste. Relics don't endure. They get processed. The human signal finally reached the translation buffer. A single line was rendered, flat and clear. We do not consent, the chamber barely reacted. Consent was irrelevant. Law flowed one way, from orbit down. The evaluator gestured, and the line was tagged and archived, its defiance preserved for scholars who studied extinct cultures. Below, Earth rotated, unaware or unconcerned, its defenders holding position inside their gravity well, not scattering, not hiding. 67 ships sat like blunt stones against a tidal wave. Processing timers ticked down. At C0:03:10, the Imperial Fleet finished alignment. At C0:02:45, firing solutions finalized. At C0:02:00, the Grand Evaluator allowed himself a thin smile. 4 minutes was more than enough. The order to fire queued quietly, perfectly. Waiting for a world that did not yet understand it had already been decided. The refusal was transmitted without ceremony. It cut through Imperial channels in plain band, unencrypted, riding brute signal strength instead of protocol. No anthem. No symbolic flourish. Just a human voice, steady and unraised, as if speaking to an equal rather than an armada. This is Earth Defense Command, it said. We reject all compliance demands. The command spire registered mild surprise. Refusal was common in primitives. It usually ended between volleys. The voice continued. Evacuation corridors are now open. Vectors marked Alpha through Delta. Window duration, 6 hours. Civilian traffic only. A new overlay appeared on the tactical sphere. 4 clean lanes cut through Imperial orbital geometry, extending from Earth's upper atmosphere to open space, shielded, stabilized, real. Imperial analysts blinked as the math resolved. The corridors were wide enough to matter. Wide enough to force adjustments, if acknowledged. Presumptive, the Grand Evaluator said coolly. They assume authority. They assume mercy, a prefect replied, amused. The corridors were logged as psychological theatre. 6 hours was an absurd offer from a species facing extinction. The civilian capacity estimate, 20,000, was flagged as exaggeration bordering on delusion. Humans rely on sentiment, the evaluator said. They always do. The human transmission resumed, tone unchanged. We will not fire on evacuation. Traffic. We will fire on Imperial vessels that obstruct it. A pause followed. Not dramatic, procedural. This is your only notice. The chamber returned to quiet confidence. No debate followed. Imperial doctrine did not recognize evacuation demands issued by targets. Civilians were resources. Their movement was the Empire's decision, not the enemy's. Dismissal orders propagated. No changes to the firing schedule. On the grid, Earth's defenders did something unexpected. They did not scatter. They did not retreat behind planetary shields. The 67 ships tightened formation, drawing closer together, overlapping sensor shadows until individual hulls blurred into a single mass. Why compress? A junior tactician asked. They reduce maneuver space. They don't intend to maneuver, another replied. They intend to die together. Primitive solidarity. Noted. At 110,000 kilometers, Imperial ships held position, immaculate and untouchable. Energy arrays still cycling up toward ceremonial perfection. The humans drifted forward, slowly, without stealth or disguise. Drives, burning openly, distance closing by thousands of kilometers with almost insulting transparency. Bluffing primitives, making noise before extinction. The evacuation corridors remained open, empty at first. Then a flicker, civilian craft breaking from orbital stations, hesitating, then committing as Imperial patrols failed to intercept. More followed. Transponder lights multiplied. An analyst frowned. They're actually using the corridors. Let them run, the Grand Evaluator said. It changes nothing. Casualty projections were recalculated to account for reduced civilian presence. Imperial losses remained at 0. The human voice spoke one last time before silence. You are choosing the timeline. No threat followed, no appeal. At 90,000 kilometers, the Imperial firing order pulsed from amber toward green. The Empire prepared to demonstrate the cost of refusal, confident that the primitives had mistaken defiance for leverage. The corridors stayed open. The humans kept closing. And for the first time, the Imperial Fleet found itself responding, not to fear, but to a refusal that did not need to raise its voice. The first volley was timed to be instructive. 10,000 Imperial emitters discharged in perfect synchrony, energy bands braided into a lattice designed to erase continents. The beams crossed 90,000 kilometers in a blink, converging on the compressed human formation with ceremonial precision. They struck and vanished. On the tactical sphere, the human ships bloomed with soft coronas as light washed over armor and died. No reflection, no diffusion. The energy simply ceased, swallowed into hulls that glowed dull red for a fraction of a second before dimming again. Impact assessment, the Grand Evaluator said, already displeased. Penetration at 0, a systems officer replied. All bands, 0%. A ripple passed through the spire. Secondary arrays fired immediately, frequencies shifting, amplitudes stacked, output tripled in under 2 seconds. The Empire had ended wars with less adjustment. The beams hit harder, the humans held, thermal overlays surged, then stabilized. Heat maps plateaued across every human hull, as if capped by design. Numbers scrolled where alarms should have been. Human. Heat budget utilization, 59%, remaining margin, 41%. That's not possible, someone said. The analyst swallowed. They're converting energy into mass displacement and sink. Layered armor is acting as a distributed capacitor. It's crude, but stable. Crude meant reliable. Dead fire. Imperial Command ordered a saturation spike. Capacitors dumped reserves. Output surged to 180% nominal for 12 seconds. a maneuver reserved for extinction-level targets. The lattice fused into a single spear of light. It died on contact. Sensors registered a brief flare as energy vanished into meters-thick armor, then nothing. Human radiators vented excess heat in controlled plumes, bright for a moment, then gone. Hull integrity across the formation remained green, efficiency loss displayed in stark numerals. Energy absorbed, 68%, energy redirected and vented, 32%, structural damage, negligible. The spire went quiet. The unknown human flagship took the brunt, its forward armor glowing, then cooling, its trajectory unchanged. Escorts tightened formation further, overlapping fields, sharing load like a species accustomed to being shot at by gods. They kept closing. Range ticked down to 82,000 kilometers. Imperial captains began to adjust, micro-corrections rippling through. The formation as commanders compensated for fire that no longer mattered. Power curves strained. Reactors that had been pushed beyond doctrine limits protested. 2 cruisers dropped output as safeties tripped, shields flickering under the stress of continuous discharge. The humans did not target them. They passed through the gaps, drives steady, armor forward, as if the Empire's greatest weapon was weather. Primitive. Armor. Advanced consequence. The human broadcast returned, identical in tone to before. Imperial energy fire ineffective. Evacuation corridors remain open. Time remaining. 5 hours, 42 minutes. No mockery. No emphasis. Just data. A legal prefect opened a channel, then closed it. There was no clause for this, no provision for a species that let you exhaust your best tools without comment. At 75,000 kilometers, the human formation adjusted vector by less than a degree, bringing its mass fully to bear. Sensors flagged kinetic systems spooling, rail assemblies aligning, missile bays cycling behind armored shutters. The realization landed too late. Imperial casualty projections updated for the first time. Not rounded, not abstract. Small numbers appeared, then grew. Driven not by enemy fire but by internal failures, overheated reactors, collapsed shields, crews injured under sustained output they had never trained to endure. The Grand Evaluator stared at the dead light on the grid. It beams that meant nothing now. The first reversal was complete, and the humans were still closing. Distance stopped behaving like a shield. Human drives flared, not in a burst, not in a panic sprint, but in a unified burn that pushed mass forward, with unapologetic force. Acceleration readings climbed past Imperial tolerances in seconds, then kept rising. Velocity, the Grand Evaluator demanded. 0.3 C, came the answer. Increasing, sustained. Murmurs rippled through. The spire. Imperial doctrine treated acceleration as a resource to be rationed, a thing that bent crews and strained hulls. This was different. This was a species that had built ships and people to endure it. At 70,000 kilometers, the human formation tightened. Further then split, not into chaos but into disciplined sub-wedges. 67 ships moved as a single organism, overlapping armor faces and sensor shadows, compressing space ahead of them. Imperial captains began to maneuver at last. Lateral shifts, altitude changes, attempts to reassert orbital geometry and regain distance. The problem was time. The humans were stealing it. Formation integrity degraded by 6% as ships adjusted independently. Then 10, then 14, as commanders argued over whether to hold ceremonial spacing or prioritize survival. Maintain shell alignment, Imperial Command ordered. They couldn't. Continuous energy discharge had already strained reactors and shields. Maneuvering under thrust compounded the load. 3 ships dropped out of the firing lattice as safeties tripped, their shield harmonics collapsing into static. The humans did not target them. They flowed through the gaps, drives still burning, wedge reforming on the far side with unsettling precision. They're not charging, they're compressing. At 45,000 kilometers, Imperial sensors resolved the next problem. Human kinetic systems were spooling, rail assemblies aligning along forward spines, missile bays cycling behind thick shutters. The humans had waited until distance was no longer a debate. Break formation, a tactician shouted. Too late. Integrity fell to 21% as captains made individual calculations. Elegant arcs bent into uneven clusters. Shield overlaps failed. Blind spots opened, small at first, then cascading as human subwedges slid into them with brutal simplicity. The unknown human flagship adjusted by half a degree, a correction so small it was almost polite, placing its mass directly on a collision course with the densest Imperial cluster. It did not slow. It trusted armor measured in meters and crews conditioned for sustained crush. Imperial Command authorized emergency. Dispersal. Ships peeled away in all directions, drives flaring in short, desperate burns. The orbital shell shattered into thousands of independent vectors. The humans followed the physics, not the fear. Acceleration held at 0.3 c. Distance collapsed from 30,000 kilometers to 18,000 in moments. The human broadcast did not return. There was nothing left to clarify. Imperial casualty counters began to tick upward, not from enemy fire, but from the cost of motion. Crew injuries under thrust, reactor faults, shields failing in ways they were never meant to fail during what was supposed to be a clean extermination. At 12,000 kilometers, the truth settled in. If you cannot stop the closing burn, the fight is already over. The human formation locked its angles, every ship exactly where it needed to be, kinetics fully online, mass and momentum aligned. Space between the fleets ceased to be a buffer and became a liability. The Imperial line was no longer a line, it was a target. The first human shot rewrote the battle. At 11,800 kilometers, the unknown human flagship authorized fire. Not a barrage, a solution. Forward rails spun with restrained violence, capacitors dumping into coils designed to survive the answer. 12 slugs launched, each massed 130 metric tons. Each left the rails at a calculated fraction of light, spaced by microseconds, sequenced, to arrive as one event. No guidance, no correction, just math applied with patience. They crossed the gap in under a second. Imperial shields failed like etiquette meeting momentum. Energy barriers, tuned for elegance and dispersion, had no language, for force that refused to negotiate. The slugs punched through the lead command cruiser's prow, exited through its aft quarter, and continued, ripping into the carrier behind it, then a third hull in line before fragmenting into plasma beyond. Kill confirmations populated the grid. 3 ships. Time to impact, 0.9 seconds. Missile bays irised open across the human formation, not swarms, lattices. 960 launches in the first wave, each missile simple by Imperial standards and lethal by human ones. They flew in tight packets, staggered and layered, designed to overwhelm point defenses that had evolved, to dual piers, not survive storms. Interceptors screamed to life. Dozens of missiles died, then hundreds. It wasn't enough. Detonations blossomed inside shield gaps already torn open by rails. Nuclear signatures flared, low yield by human reckoning. City killers by anyone else's, time to arrive after penetration, not before. The elegant line bent, then snapped. Another counter ticked. Chore. Imperial Command tried to reassert order, broadcasting priorities and fallback vectors. The orders reached ships already dying. Human fire did not chase fleeing hulls. It cut lanes, severing clusters, isolating groups, turning coordination into an unsolvable problem. At 8,500 kilometers, the humans adjusted cadence. Rails cycled again, slower now, paired with missile salvos timed to follow. Slugs opened wounds. Missiles made them final. It was not rage. It was procedure. An Imperial dreadhull attempted a desperate ram, dumping everything into engines and lunging for the flagship. Human sensors solved the vector in 0.2 seconds. A single nuclear intercept met it at 3,000 kilometers, close enough to shear, far enough to spare neighbors. The dreadhull broke in two and kept drifting. Casualty counter, been 1. They could have erased everything. They didn't. Human targeting logic filtered civilian compliments with brutal clarity. Ships broadcasting non-combatant loads were bracketed, not engaged. Fire curved away from evacuation traffic, even as combatants beside them were dismantled. The corridors, dismissed minutes earlier, filled with fleeing craft. Hesitant, then desperate, then committed as Imperial patrols failed to stop them. You fired first. We finished the math. At 5,000 kilometers, debris thickened into lethal fog. Imperial ships collided with their own wreckage, shields gone, hulls already compromised. Secondary explosions chained through formations that no longer existed, elegant designs undone by physics they had mocked. Human escorts advanced through the chaos, armor scarred, heat sinks venting in controlled pulses. Damage reports scrolled in calm text, all with intolerance. Not a single human hull was breached. Missiles remaining, 6,180. Rail barrels, green. Nuclear intercepts expended. 16. The first blood ended without a crescendo. Space cleared in jagged swaths, where the Empire's best ships had been. The human formation, eased thrust just enough to reassess, weapons tracking, but disciplined. The invasion had crossed a line it could not retreat from. The fight was no longer a gamble. It was an operation. This was not escalation. It was clarification. As wreckage drifted into stable arcs, the human broadcast returned, unchanged in tone, unchanged in pace. It threaded through Imperial command bands and open civilian channels alike, impossible to jam without shutting down. The fleet's own sensors. This conflict is bounded, the voice said. It ends when compliance begins. New overlays replaced target grids, not weapons, limits, casualty caps rendered in calm white numerals, exclusion zones traced clean geometry around evacuation corridors now crowded with traffic. Civilian. Craft poured through Alpha and Beta lanes, transponders flaring as crews realized, too late, that the offer had been real. Evacuation count ticked upward. 4 million, 9 million, 1 million. Imperial command attempted to suppress the feed. It failed. The signal rode redundant carriers and brute power, a philosophy consistent with everything else the humans had built. You were offered time, the voice continued. 6 hours. You chose minutes. No accusation, no emphasis, just a record. Context followed. Archived Imperial directives surfaced. Processing classifications, forced relocations, population compliance ratios reduced to clean percentages. The humans did not editorialize. They let the documents speak, cold and complete, to a galaxy that had never been permitted to see them assembled in one place. This is an anti-tyranny action, the voice said. Civilian casualties are capped at 0 by intent. Military casualties are capped by choice. Numbers appeared beside the words. Projected losses if resistance continued. Projected losses if surrender was accepted. The delta was unmistakable. Casualty, difference. 18,400 lives. Across the grid, human ships demonstrated the claim. Fire paused when targets disengaged. Weapons powered down as evacuation traffic crossed arcs measured in meters, not kilometers. A damaged Imperial cruiser drifted into Corridor Gamma, shields flickering, drives dead. Human escorts adjusted course by meters to avoid frightening it. No pursuit, no finishing blow. Dominance, then restraint. Evacuation count. Crossed 12 million dots, a junior Imperial legal officer whispered what no one else would. They're building jurisdiction. The Grand Evaluator said nothing. There was no doctrine for this. Imperial law assumed inevitability. The humans had introduced accountability. This engagement concludes upon cessation of hostile fire, the broadcast continued. Prisoners will be taken. Trials will be public. Aid will follow. The word trials landed harder than any rail. Impact. On the margins of the battle space, human vessels repositioned, not to press advantage, but to stabilize. Debris was flagged and herded. Shield projections turned outward, protecting evacuation lanes from stray fire. Medical hulls moved in, their arrival time to projections written before the first shot was fired. Evacuation count, 16.8 million. The galaxy-scale stakes crystallized as distant systems tuned in. Observers became witnesses. Witnesses became record. This was not a war for territory or tribute. It was a line being enforced with mass, and a refusal to look away. "You are not being conquered," the human voice concluded. "You are being stopped." Evacuation count finalized at 20,000. The Gikoroitki. Numbers settled. The firing slowed. And in the quiet that followed, the Empire understood that it was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting against its own ledger. The pattern resolved where denial had lived. Imperial command searched for chaos and found none. Human movements followed sequences too clean to be improvised, transitions too smooth to be reactions. The more data flowed in, the clearer it became that every phase unfolding had been written long before the first shot. Containment rings appeared on the tactical display, not weapons envelopes, but navigation constraints. Invisible walls defined by interdiction fields and overlapping thrust denial, boxing the remaining Imperial ships into a shrinking volume of space measured in cubic kilometers and seconds. "They're shaping the battlefield," a tactician said, quietly. They had already shaped it. Additional human contacts resolved beyond the immediate engagement zone. Not reinforcements racing in late, but assets already in position. Logistics hulls, hospital ships, repair tenders, 34 of them, distributed along projected evacuation paths and debris vectors, synchronized with traffic flow and casualty models. They had arrived hours earlier, ignored, because no one had thought to look beyond the guns. This wasn't a duel. It never was. Imperial analysts dug deeper, pulling at threads they had dismissed as irrelevant. Earth's orbital infrastructure lit up with redundancy. Layered sensor webs, hardened command nodes, fallback relays buried in gravity wells. The 67 defending ships were not the point of defense. They were the visible edge of it. Human doctrine packets flooded open channels next, stripped of classification with deliberate intent. Not propaganda. Briefings. The humans explained, themselves with the same calm they had used to announce evacuation corridors. Phase 1, absorb and close. Phase 2, break cohesion. Phase 3, contain and stabilize. Phase 4 existed. It was listed. Grayed out, an Imperial strategist stared at its throat dry. They planned for escalation beyond this, they said, and chose not to use it. Human preparation revealed itself in quiet details. Armor layering optimized not just for survival, but for load sharing across formations. Acceleration profiles. They matched long-duration crew conditioning programs, not emergency burns. Even the missile inventory told a story. Thousands expended, tens of thousands untouched, held in reserve for contingencies that had not been triggered. They expected this to take longer. On the grid, human ships rotated through firing, cooling, and recovery cycles with metronomic discipline. Damaged Imperial vessels were tagged, tracked, and herded away from combat zones, boxed by non-lethal fields that denied escape without inflicting further harm. Prisoner collection accelerated before any formal surrender was transmitted. Numbers. Updated with quiet inevitability. Prisoners secured, 6,200, then 11,900. Medical teams deployed immediately. Human medics crossed hulls and species lines without hesitation, stabilizing enemies with the same efficiency they applied to their own crews. "This is not invasion," the Grand Evaluator said, the words brittle. "It's enforcement." "No," one corrected them. The human broadcast updated once more, brief and procedural. "Containment perimeter established. Hostile fire reduced to 9%. Projected cessation within 120 seconds. It wasn't a warning, it was a schedule. Imperial captains, still capable of thought, understood the final humiliation then. The humans were not reacting to Imperial choices. They were managing them, the way one managed storms or outbreaks, with protocols written long before first contact. Evacuation traffic cleared the last corridor. Shields flexed and sealed behind it. The numbers locked. Evacuated civilians, 20,000. The Imperial Fleet, assembled to enforce inevitability, sat broken inside a box it had never imagined someone would build around it. Phase 4 remained grayed, out. And for the first time, the Empire understood that Earth had never been unprepared. It had been waiting. 4 minutes was the margin the humans had assigned. The counter rolled on the shared feed without emphasis, a simple chronometer that did not care who watched it. From the first rail impact to containment lock, time was treated as another variable to be managed. The remaining Imperial ships fired in bursts now, ragged, unsynchronized flashes that bled harmlessly across human armor. Hostile fire volume dropped from 9% to 6%, then to 3%, as reactors failed and targeting solutions collapsed under pressure they were never designed to endure. Human ships moved. Not in a charge, in a sweep. Subwedges detached from the core formation, each assigned a volume of space defined by cubic kilometers and seconds to clear it. Rails fired in pairs, precise and restrained, targeting engine clusters and command spines instead of cores. Missile salvos followed, smaller than before, detonating with yields tuned to disable without cascading destruction. The kill counter advanced in steady increments. 1, 3, 5. At 2,400 kilometers, a knot of Imperial destroyers attempted a coordinated break, dumping everything into a single acceleration burn. Human interceptors responded in 0.3 seconds. 4 nuclear intercepts bloomed ahead of the vector, not close enough to vaporize, close enough to shred. The destroyers emerged broken, drives gone, hulls venting atmosphere into vacuum. Prisoner beacons, activated automatically. Human escorts slid in, containment fields expanding, cutting the wrecks out of the fight without another shot. Ruthless. Measured. The counter crossed 2 minutes. Imperial Command made its last attempt at relevance, ordering all remaining ships to converge on the unknown human flagship. It was an old reflex. Mass fire overwhelmed the center, proved that nothing was untouchable, the convergence never formed. Human containment fields flexed and denied approach vectors, forcing staggered arrivals that stripped the maneuver of meaning. Ships arrived alone or in pairs, met by railfire, timed to milliseconds. Slugs punching through hulls, already stressed by failed burns. At 1,700 kilometers, 3 capital ships were holed in sequence, a single rail solution passing through multiple targets before disintegrating into plasma beyond. Missile lattices followed, detonations timed so precisely that wreckage could not be used as cover. You cannot hide inside broken geometry. The casualty counter climbed, then slowed, then steadied, as resistance evaporated. Human fire tapered with it, shifting from destruction to denial. Drives were neutralized, power cores scrammed, weapons went cold. At 3 minutes, hostile fire dropped below 1%. A lone Imperial cruiser drifted, hull intact but systems dead, across what had once been corridor beta. Human ships adjusted course by meters to avoid collision. No one fired. A docking clamp extended. Prisoners were taken. Mercy followed dominance, on schedule. The chronometer approached the 4-minute mark. The tactical sphere showed no coherent enemy formations remaining, only isolated hulls, tagged and boxed, awaiting processing that no longer meant erasure. The human broadcast updated once more during the fighting, voice as steady as ever. Hostile. Fire at 0.6%. Ceasefire conditions met. Rails went silent. Missile bays sealed. Human ships did not celebrate. They reconfigured. Damage control drones deployed in disciplined swarms. Medical traffic spiked as logistics hulls moved in, their arrival times matching projections written before the invasion fleet had even translated in. The counter rolled to force gay 4 minutes. That was all. What remained of the Imperial invasion? Force sat immobilized inside a lattice of human control. Weapons offline, power constrained, futures abruptly uncertain. Across the galaxy, observers watched the numbers settle into stillness, the way one watched a storm pass and realized the landscape would never be the same. Human ships held position, engines idling, armor scarred but unbroken. The obliteration window closed, not with annihilation, but with a quiet dominance so complete it felt inevitable in retrospect. 4 minutes was not a boast. It was a benchmark. The terms arrived after the guns went silent, They were not framed as victory. They were framed as procedure, a structured packet propagated across every open Imperial channel, mirrored on civilian bands and neutral relays. Clauses numbered, conditions explicit, timestamps attached. It assumed compliance because nothing else made sense anymore. "Hostilities have ceased," the human voice said, returning with the same unhurried cadence. "What follows is process." On the grid, human ships made the shift visible. Rail. Systems powered down in stages. Missile bays sealed. Containment fields remained, firm, non-lethal, patient. Imperial vessels drifted inside them, immobilized and tagged, no longer targets, but responsibilities. Prisoner operations expanded immediately. Boarding teams crossed distances measured in meters, not kilometers now. No forced breaches. Airlocks cycled cleanly, wounded were stabilized where they lay. Species differences were logged and accommodated without comment. Prisoners secured, 18,400, medical aid followed without delay. Human triage hulls moved through the containment volume, their protocols ruthless about survival and indifferent to allegiance. Pain control first, bleeding second, identity later. "This action does not authorize summary punishment," the terms stated. "All detained personnel will receive public trial under jointly observed standards." Public, the word spread faster than the document itself. Public meant records. Records meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant that decades of Imperial enforcement, actions, processing orders, population quotas, compliance raids, would be examined by eyes that had never been allowed to see them assembled in one place. Imperial legal authorities attempted to assert exclusive jurisdiction. The human response was immediate and precise. "Jurisdiction is shared. Oversight is mandatory. Proceedings will be broadcast." There was no leverage left to apply. Aid clauses activated next. Logistics hulls released cargo in controlled waves. Power. Cells, medical supplies, structural foam, atmosphere processors. Prioritized for damaged Imperial ships still carrying civilians. Stabilization zones replaced evacuation corridors, guarded by human shields tuned to deflect debris and stray fire alike. "You broke the order. We will hold it together." Across Imperial space, the political structure began to fail quietly. Member, systems that had contributed ships to the invasion transmitted acknowledgements. First cautious, then explicit. Not surrender. Recognition. Recognition that the old certainty had cracked, and that pretending otherwise would only increase the cost. The terms were explicit about limits. No annexation, no tribute, no permanent occupation. Human forces would withdraw upon completion of trials and the transfer of enforcement authority to a reconstituted, multi-species body with audited powers and public mandates. Compliance milestones appeared beside each clause, dates, verification protocols. Consequences stated without threat. Inflation. Failure would not trigger conquest, it would trigger renewed containment. Imperial command, what remained of it, signed. The signature did not feel like defeat. It felt like exposure. Human ships adjusted. Formation again, loosening the containment lattice by measured degrees. Space opened just enough to signal trust without relinquishing control. It was a balance the Empire had never practiced. As the first trial notices were issued and the first aid convoys docked, the galaxy watched an empire collapse without being burned away, its authority undone not by extermination, but by daylight. The human voice concluded the transmission with a final line, almost administrative in its restraint. "These terms take effect immediately, and with that, the Imperial Order stopped pretending it was inevitable." The line moved once the signatures were filed. Human ships did not hold a victory posture, they transitioned. Weapons remained cold, sensors widened. Navigation grids expanded outward, past the drifting wreckage and beyond the orbital lanes that had defined Imperial certainty for centuries. Containment became guardianship. Logistics hulls detached first, their vectors aimed not at conquered space, but at damaged systems flagged during the engagement. Worlds the Imperial Fleet had passed without slowing, distress calls logged and deprioritized. Human crews deployed power, atmosphere, food, and time with the same procedural calm they had applied to war. On the shared strategic map, a new layer faded in: outer rim space, sparse traffic, long baselines between stars, regions the Empire had, labeled uneconomical and left to whatever survived there. Sensor returns pulsed at the edge of resolution, patterns emerging where randomness should have been. Anomalous movement confirmed, a human analyst reported on an open channel. Doctrine? Match exterminator class. No alarm followed. No spike in posture. Just confirmation. The data was released immediately. Distances measured in light years, timelines measured in months, loss projections calculated under the assumption of inaction. The numbers made the conclusion unavoidable. Beyond, the line. Something was moving, and it was not patient. Exploration and early warning vessels separated from the main formation. Leaner hulls with broader mission sets. Not scouts for conquest, but surveyors and anchors, seeded along vectors the Empire had never mapped properly. Guardians placed before the threat arrived. Council and Imperial observers watched in silence as humans did something unfamiliar. They planned forward. "This is not an extension of hostilities," the human broadcast said, addressing the wider galaxy for the first time since the fighting ended. "It is continuity of responsibility." Participation terms followed. Voluntary. Shared oversight. Transparent command structures. Numbers attached to everything. Ships required, timelines, attrition thresholds that assumed restraint rather than expendability. No demand. An offer. Human fleets thinned as ships departed on long arcs, their destinations, marked by faint symbols near the edge of known space. Others remained, holding position as stabilizers, while new frameworks took shape, legal, logistical, and navigational structures that did not depend on fear to function. The unknown human. Flagship lingered last. Its armor was still scarred. Heat sinks still radiated the memory of absorbed fire. It rotated slowly, not toward the defeated Imperial hulls, but toward the dark beyond mapped charts. Final tallies scrolled across the grid, unadorned. Battle duration: 4 minutes. Civilians evacuated, 20,000 prisoners alive, 18,400 civilian casualties, 0 by intent. Benchmarks met. The war had ended exactly where the humans said it would. The future, however, had already begun moving. Drives flared, controlled, steady, and the flagship aligned with the outward vectors. One by one, human ships crossed the line the Empire had never defended, carrying with them a doctrine that did not stop at winning. It stopped at holding what came next.